So here we are with our June online talk. We're still in the comfort of our sitting rooms, but hopefully this will be the last time that we have to do it solely through Zoom. The next talk that we have is scheduled for September. July will be the walkabout quiz, and August we may be doing something with Carnival. That still has to be decided. So we hope that Julia's talk in September on the interesting and all-pervasive pizzies can be in the chapel, fingers crossed. And in the meanwhile, the walkabout quiz, please remember the 24th and 5th of July will be the walkabout quiz. We'd like to have as many of you as possible walking around the village, finding out things that you've been here all these years and never noticed before. Alan and Deletta have been working hard on that for the last, well, quite some time. Tonight, both Cassie and I are going to talk, and we're going to introduce some of the new items we've added to our collection in the past few months, and the background as to how they came into existence and why. But just before we do, I should remind you that we're actually recording this. So if you want to be absolutely certain that you don't appear on our recording, we do our best to make sure you don't. But if you want to be absolutely certain, you could perhaps disable your camera. I can see that 6 people so far have. Questions. If you have questions, we'd prefer those, if you don't mind, if they could wait until the end of the session. You can also send a question using the chat facility, which you'll find at the bottom of your screen. If you use that, send a chat message to me as the host, and I will then ask it at the end of the session. And at the end of the session, we'll also open up the muting so that you have a chance to unmute yourself and ask questions directly. And that's basically all I have to say. So I'm going to hand over for the moment to Cassie for her to start tonight's entertainment.
Okay, so let's share that. Then I switch to that one. Okay, so new acquisitions. We've just got a couple to show you at this point. Firstly, bells, here we are. And Crotal, Robert Wells Crotal, size 26. You might just be able to make that out. That fits into a sequence. We've got increasing sizes. This is towards the upper end, but not the biggest. So I think we're still looking for 24, but that's one of our acquisitions. Now the next, this isn't what we acquired. This is what we had up till now, and not a very high quality photo. But we came across online a copy of this image actually as a proper printed postcard. So we now have that, and you'll see how much more improved the quality is. The previous one even had the date truncated, so we might have thought that it was 1919. Well, actually, no, it's 1909. And we can see a lot more detail, and obviously it's nowhere near as damaged. So that's, we're really rather pleased with that. And that's one of the earliest photos. You'll notice it says Carno Vale, quite how that relates to Carnival, and it's on a Carnival sort of date on the 30th of December. But yeah, it's still a very rare image that we've managed to get hold of, so we're rather pleased with that. So on to tokens and traders, our own coinage. So now, forgive me, but this is worth bearing with. Gresham's law. This is Sir Thomas Gresham, a financier under Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. He wasn't actually first to describe this bad money drives out good, but a Victorian historian named it after the Englishman rather than the ancient Greek or the Chinese, the Victorians being what they were. So basically, any debased or lower value coinage that's nominally the same value as a better one is going to come to dominate circulation. So modern examples, when we switched from silver coins to copper and nickel in 1947, the silver vanished very quickly because people suddenly decided to hold on to it and melt it down or keep it as something unusual. Similarly, as soon as the Kew Gardens 50p became available, became identified as being ultra rare, they vanished from circulation because their value was so much higher. All you were left with was the sort of lower value normal value 50p. So there's all sorts of things that motivate people. Sometimes it's hoarding, sometimes it's actually extracting value from the coins when they're bullion metals. So anyway, that's worth bearing in mind as we head through some of these things. Gresham's law is quite a nuisance for government. Tokens wise, medieval times, there's things called jetons. As best as we understand it, they were used as counters when doing accounts. Maybe used in gaming as well, but they did seem to have very wide circulation. This example is created by Hans Krawinkel of Nuremberg, but it was found in Wiltshire. So I wonder whether they were also being used for coinage, because I don't quite see why anyone would have bothered carrying counters across, but there we are. So stepping on, most of us are aware, or we've heard of, the gold standard. Well, actually, for longer, Britain was on the silver standard. Silver was the key element. That's why we pound sterling silver. And that ran all the way from the Saxon era on. They started introducing gold coins more often in medieval times, so 1300s. And that's a gold noble, first successful gold coin from 1344. But even early on, there were problems. By 1404, this is post Black Death, so you'd already got medieval patterns of subsistence farming breaking down, and you've got more trade increasing, more workers needing to be paid. And so there was an increasing need for small change, and there just wasn't enough being created, and small enough pieces, because silver pennies could be halved into half pennies, and sometimes you come across them in quartered, but then they're tiny little chits of things, and not very identifiable even. So James I sold a patent to Lord Harrington of Rutland in 1613 rather, to create brass farthings. But the forgers got in on the act, and they very rapidly had to sort of declare the old ones useless, and a lot of people lost money overnight. And in 1644, those were officially suppressed. No alternative was offered. By the time of the Commonwealth, so post Charles I, patents had been struck in copper and pewter, but none were actually authorised to be issued, and there was lots of indecision and discussion. And we barely had a government really to speak of in those times, and everyone had bigger issues to think about. And the laws to control the production of unofficial farthings were pretty ineffective. So you combine that with debasement. So clipping of coins we know about, that The picture top is a hoard that was found of clippings of coins. Sweating is a bit more unusual. It sounds weird, but basically you put all the coins in the bag and shake them vigorously until you get a lot of sort of silver filings left at the bottom of your bag. And it's very difficult to convict anyone of sweating because it just looks like wear. And plugging, although that's an American coin, unless you've got a really good monitor, you won't be able to tell where the plug is. Someone's drilled a couple of holes in it and replaced the silver with a base metal. So, so Gresham's law kicks in. All the low value coins will remain in circulation as nobody wants them. Higher ones will be hoarded or exported or turned into lower value ones. So that's where the whole background to local farthings. So there's not enough small change. We've got devalued silver coinage. And so lots of places started issuing their own farthings and halfpennies. Even town councils did. It was becoming that official. And that it was so widespread demonstrates how needed it was. That's the context to what John's going to talk about. So, John.
I'm going to talk about 4 traders in Aldbourne who issued that type of token. What their trades were and what we know about them and their families. But first of all, I'd better show you the tokens that we've been lucky enough to add to our collection over the past month or two. Here's the first lot. Can you see that, Cassie? Yeah, good. I decided it was better to fill the screen to make it bigger for all of you. Here are the first group of 7 which we've recently purchased at auction. This one here on the top left is by Richard Clarke from 1668, and the one here center right and lower right are again versions of the same coin issued by Richard Clarke. And on the back of those coins, we can see Aldbourne, Wiltshire. Aldbourne, A-L-B-O-R-N, Wiltshire. Beautifully spelt W-I-L-T-S-H-E-R, Wiltshire. So we have 3 by Richard Clarke. We have 3 by John Adey of Aldbourne. That's the front side of one, and here is the obverse of that same coin, basically, showing the 3 rabbits, relating, of course, to our Warrens, and the date 1656. So we've got 1, 2, 3 John Adeys, and then center of the bottom row with a weaving shuttle on it to show, so we have an idea of his trade. This is a token of Edward Witts. And again, if we look on the back, in Auburn, A-W-B-O-R-N-E, Auburn, 1666. So that's the first group of tokens which we've recently purchased. And in the same auction, which is actually an auction of one of the largest collections in the country, a collector recently died, and his collection is was being sold at auction, which is where these all came from. We've got 5 coins in the second group, only one of which actually interests us. These 2 here at the top right are 2 tokens by Richard Marsh of Ashton Keynes, and the 2 at the bottom are by John Clarke of Bishopston. Now those we'll put back on the market to recover some of our expenditure on these. The one we are interested in looks to be one by I. Clark, the same as these two down here, John Clark of Bishopston. But when we look to the other side, there is that same token. And on the other side, it's by John Adey of Aldbourne. So there was some kind of linkage between John Adey of Aldbourne and John Clark of Bishopston. They traded in some way together such that they had a joint coin. That auction had barely finished when we became aware of another coin being offered by a dealer. And this is by Francis Strong of Aldbourne and is dated 1669. So yet another coin by an Aldbourne trader. There are 4 traders: John Adey, Richard Clark, Edward Witts, and Francis Strong. This is slightly different in that this is a halfpenny token rather than a farthing token, which of course were a quarter of a penny. So I'm going to talk about those 4 families and the traders and their families: Clark, Strong, Witts, and Adey. And just to give you some idea of how big those coins are, they are the smallest things that we own. They are tiny, tiny, tiny. That's my index finger. But they are very rare, and we're very, very pleased to have them. Right, Richard Clark, Aldbourne, Wiltshire. Interesting that he refers to himself as RCE. We'll come to why that is in a moment. The Clark family, we know very little about them. The first Clarks that appear in the Aldbourne registers are only in 1662 to 1666, with 3 burials of people who've never been mentioned before. But what we have found is that in 1655, there's the baptism of Timothy, the son of Richard and Mary Elliot, alias Clark. And he was baptized November the 18th of 1655. Elliot, alias Clark. And we also have discovered the burial in 1670 of Richard Elliot, alias Clark, June the 8th, 1670. And we find a number of different references to Elliot, alias Clark. And this appears to be our Richard Elliot, Richard Clark. Giving the Bishopston connection, there's at least one marriage in Bishopston at around this time of a Richard Clark marrying to Merlin Dymond of the parish of Little Hinton on the 3rd day of December 1666. Still fairly inconclusive. So if we look at family wills of the Clark family, John Clark of Aldbourne, he died before our registers started in 1624, and he had not made a will. So his wife Alice had to go to the court to obtain authorization to administer his estate. And this is the document she got from the court. The first part is in Latin, I'm not going to translate it all, but I will do Noverint Universi per presentes nos Aliciam Clark de Olborn. Know all men by these presents that we, Alice Clark of Olborn, in Comitate Wilts in the county of Wiltshire, widow, and Richard Clark, undertake to administer the estate of, here's the mention of John Clark down here. They have agreed to administer the estate of John Clark according to law on penalty of a fairly large bond. And this is the bond document itself. And that document has been signed by Alice Clark, who clearly could not sign her name, but she has this rather wonderful squiggle as her mark. On the other hand, Richard Clark, who's mentioned, who we'll see is her son, is a highly educated man. He signs himself in a beautifully clear hand. He's clearly had quite some considerable education. Attached to the that administration document is an inventory of all of the goods that formed part of the estate, an inventory of the goods of John Clark of Olborn, deceased, taken the 14th day of November 1624. But it's a bit disappointing as far as giving us information about their trade is concerned, because it's purely concerned with what he has, his household goods. In the hall, he's got a cupboard and 3 chairs, a table and 5 stools. In the chamber above the hall, he's got bedsteads and a feather bed. And in another chamber, he's got a second bedstead. And in the kitchen, K-I-C-H-I-N-G, in the kitchen, we've got all the things that he cooks with, the pots and kettles and skillets and so on. But not a word about whatever his business was. So that's really not been very much help at all. If we go on to the next will, it's the will of his widow, Alice. And here we are. In the name of God, amen. 1st day of November, 1629. I, Alice Elliot, alias Clark, widow. And she wrote, in the previous document, she was purely Alice Clark. Now she's Alice Elliot, alias Clark. And she goes on then to make a number of bequests, which I'm trying to find down here. Oh dear. Here we are. I bequeath unto my son, John Elliot, alias Clark, 1 table board, 1 cupboard, and so on and so forth. She goes on to make another bequest to her daughter. I give to my daughter, Elizabeth Powell. So she has a daughter, Elizabeth, who's married a Mr. Powell. All my wearing apparel, and 1 chest, and all that is in, and so forth. And all the rest of my goods and chattels I bequeath, and all other implements I give and bequeath to my son, Richard Elliot, alias Clark, who I make executor. And here again is Alice's squiggle mark, not quite the same as a few years earlier. So all that we've been able to find about the Clark family, nothing whatsoever about their trade, I'm afraid. But simply we've sorted out their family. And this shows us that Richard and John were brothers. And there's every reason to believe that this is the Richard Clark of Albourne and this the John Clark of Bishopston. If we look at the Strong family, this is the second of the tokens, the halfpenny of Francis Strong. If we look for the Strong family in the early registers, we find we've got a much better record of them. Francis himself appears here in 1647, baptizing his daughter Elizabeth, that he's had with his wife Mary. And then another daughter, Mary, and a son, Francis. Francis sadly dies before he's 5 years old. They then have a fourth child who is stillborn. And it was obviously a very traumatic birth because Mary herself dies just a day or so later. Francis appears to be one who didn't hang about in such things, because in less than 3 months after his wife's death, he's gone down to Chiltern Foliot to marry a lady called Margaret Reason. And that record appears actually in both churches' registers, both in Albourne Church and in Chiltern Foliot. And here are the two of them. The top is from the Albourne register, simply recording the fact they've married. And in the lower section, it says the last of June were married Francis Strong and Margaret Reason of Albourne. Though why they would have gone down there, I'm not really sure. The Albourne registers go on to tell us that Francis and Margaret had 3 further children, Jane, Thomas, and Martha, of whom the youngest, Martha, died while she was still an infant. We look at Francis's will, which he made in 1692. It starts with all the flowery expressions usual for the period. In the name of God, amen, this day of June, running the sovereign Lord and Lady William and Mary. And it goes on and about leaving his soul into the hands of Almighty God and all the rest of it, line after line, until we get down to dispose of his estate. But again, sadly, as far as we're concerned, researching into the trade, he disposes purely of his personal estate. No mention of the goods that are relevant to the trade at all. Here is the inventory which goes with it. His purse and apparel, £5. In the chamber over the hall, a bedstead and some chests and an oak chest and 3 coffers. In the chamber over the shop, another bedstead and chest. In the buttery, 3 barrels and 2 keevers, which is another kind of barrel. And in the hall, the table and 5 joined stools and all the rest of it, everything to do with his house and nothing to do with his body, with his business. But it's rather nice up here in the corner. His son, Thomas, has written Father's Will, an inventory of the goods. So Thomas liked to have it around and keep referring to Father's inventory. The next family will which is of Thomas, the son who wrote that little piece, shows that Thomas has taken over from his father. And he says, the 5th day of October in the year of our Lord, 1729, I, Thomas Strong of Albourne in the county of Wilts, fustian maker. Thomas Strong is a fustian maker, as was his father. And then he goes on to dispose of all of his goods. This will looks different because unlike the will we looked at before of Francis Strong, which was taken to the court at Salisbury for authorization for probate, Thomas feels that he's moved up in the world, and so his will is much too important to go to Salisbury. It has to go to the Archbishop's Court in Canterbury, or actually at Lambeth Palace. So this has gone to the Prerogative Court of Canterbury, and this is the copy from the National Archives, from the great ledgers into which every will from about 1360 has been copied. So they all look very much like this, with very similar writing. Thomas left bequests to several of his relatives. He and his wife had 10 children, 2 of whom died young. But the survivors married into several village families. His daughters married into the Mudge family, the Brown family, and the Wells family. Sadly, since this went to the PCC, the Prerogative Court of Canterbury, they did not keep, the court did not keep the inventories that went with the original wills. All we have are these copies of the will itself. So we're not able to see anything very much about his business property. His son, Thomas, the second Thomas, also continued the work of his father and grandfather as a fustian maker. Here is his will. In the name of God, amen. I, Thomas Strong of Albourne in the county of Wilts, fustian maker. And this is a will from 1773. This is still 100 years after the issue of our tokens. They're still in the business of making fustian. Unlike his father, Thomas and his wife, Mary Brown, had no children. And on his death, he was at pains to ensure that every one of his relations was included in his will. The full will takes up more than 4 pages of the PCC ledger, and shows that in contrast to his grandfather, he was seriously wealthy. It gives us the names and relationships of dozens of members of his wider family. But as before, no inventory survives. So we have no light to shine on how he'd spent any of the wealth and how the business was carried on. We do, however, have a little snippet which shows that he branched out into farming as well as making fustian, because Alan, thank you, Alan Heisman, found this in one of his trolls through the National Newspaper Archive. On Friday, the 18th instant, a sheep belonging to Mr. Thomas Strong of Albourne, Wilts, was dug out of the snow where it had lain buried upwards of 3 feet deep for 12 days and nights, notwithstanding which the sheep ate hay immediately, and the day following had the use of its limbs, and it's since perfectly recovered. So Thomas Strong was now not only a fustian maker, he was also a farmer. And Their family tree is rather larger and more complex than the Clark family, but here are the three of them, grandfather, father, and son, who made those three wills that we've been looking at. We move on to the Witts family. The Witts, we can see from their token with the weaving shuttle that they are fustian makers. And the Witts family is very, very strongly represented in the Allborn registers. There are in fact 278 entries of the Witts family in the Allborn registers. Here are just the first few. And here is Edward, our fustian maker, marrying Jean Hinton in 1649. There's just the fourth entry in the list. We can have a look at, there is the entry itself. Married Anno Domini 1649, beginning March 25th. And here, this second entry, Edward Witts and Jean Hinton were married on July the 23rd, as were William Tarrant and Susanna Wheels. If we look again at the transcription, we can see that the next few entries after this are the baptisms of their children. We've got Edward in 1649-50, Richard 1656, who dies very quickly, Anthony, Mark, and Benjamin, the youngest, in 1668. Edward Senior died in 1689, and if we look at his will, oh, sorry, those are the register entries. But if we look at Edward's will, in the name of God, amen, I, Edward Witts, Senior of Allborn, County of Wilts, fustian maker, being weak in body and all the rest of the flowery stuff. It's beautifully written. This is so easy to read, this will. His occupation, as we've seen, is shown as fustian maker. And amongst his bequests, I give unto my son Edward £10 of lawful money to be paid to him. And I also give unto my son Edward, Edward, my furnace, now standing in the dwelling house. I give unto my son Richard Witts all my lands at Ewins, so Ewins Hill, and one half, where are we? And the one half of my fustian calendar, which now standeth in the calendar house adjoining to the George Inn in Allborn. I think my notes. Now, the George Inn was where the old post office was for many years, at the bottom of the green. Next to the George Inn, where Jill Reeves lives now, is a house, and on the corner of that house is a little shed with this mark, reminding us that as you look at the bottom end of the green, the house on the left, the house on the right was the George Inn, the house on the left was the calendar house of the Witts family, where they made fustian. Now, a calendar, you may not be sure what a calendar actually is. A calendar is a heated padded roller, rather like a mangle. And the cloth that was made, fustian that was made, was passed through this steam pressure device as part of the processing of the fustian. I remember calendars because my father was the chief cashier of a laundry in Cornwall, and they had big calendar machines that pressed all the sheets for half the hotels in Cornwall. The inventory that accompanies that will includes a lot of information about what went on in his business. So here is his inventory, imprimis his purse and apparel, £60 in his purse and what his clothes were worth. Item for fustian pieces in several places, £140 worth of fustian was lying around in various warehouses. For fustian and Scotch yarn in the chamber, £40 that he had in a room in the house. And then we go on to the household goods in the parlour, a table board and side cupboard and so on, in the hall, in the buttery, 20 pewter dishes, a brass warming pan, parcels of cotton wool, suddenly. And then we're back in the chamber over the parlour for bedsteads, chamber over the hall. And now we get to the bottom of the inventory. And we find one calendar house and half the calendar worth £7, 10 shillings. And then in the barn, a rook stable and one mill, a horse, an oat bin, various things, and in the shop, finally, looms and work upon them. So we've got beginning to get some idea of what's going on in their business. Edward's widow Jane follows him in 1705. And her will shows that although the bulk of Edward's estate had been entailed to her sons, she did retain some kind of interest in the business. There's no sign in her will about this because that's concerned solely with small bequests to her sons and grandchildren. She also has 2 great-grandchildren. Yes, here. Item, I give unto Grace Core and Mary Core, the daughters of my granddaughter, Grace Core, deceased, 10 shillings apiece. So her children married into the Core family. And she lived long enough to have great-grandchildren, which is pretty unusual for those days. But there's nothing in here that mentions anything to do with the business. But in the accompanying inventory, we find item 73 ends of fustians, £56, 11 and 6pence worth. Small yarn that is spun, cotton yarn, linen yarn, cotton wool, looms, furnace and tubs. So she's still involved in some way in the business of fustian making in the family. There's one later will, which is Richard. And it's significant because it shows that at least part of the family has moved away from fustian manufacturing. In the name of God, amen. I, Richard Witts of Hillwood, in the parish of Aldbourne in the county of Wilts, yeoman. Richard is a farmer. And some of the bequests that he makes in this will make it quite clear. This is a very, very big document. But some of the bequests he makes in the will make it very clear that he's fairly actively involved in the City of London. And a number of his children have married freemen of the City of London. And the extent of his wealth can be gauged by the way that his inventory starts. His wearing apparel and cash wasn't worth very much, only £2, but he has 190 sheep in the field, 7 horses and harness, 3 wagons and dung carts, 9 cow cattle, and so on. And there's also sown so many acres of wheat and so many acres of oats. So he is no longer a weaver. Richard is a farmer. Yet more, 70 ewes and lambs. He actually holds a second farm as well as the one he holds in Holborn. He's got another farm in Melksham. And here's the valuation of that farm. So a seriously wealthy chap. And here is a view of Edward Witt's family. We move on finally to the Adey family. We've got the token by John Adey, always showing these 3 rabbits, relating obviously to Albourne Warren. There's Albourne's continued preeminence in the supply of fat, juicy rabbits for the table that John Aubrey, his contemporary, was so fond of. In the Albourne registers, the Adeys, the Adey family, have a unique honour. They're the subjects of the earliest recorded dates in our registers. And it's rather strange because here in 1643, the first entry for 1643 was made, and then the vicar has taken it on himself to add in information about the Adey family. Anne, the daughter of Richard and Judith Adey, was baptized February the 21st, 1613. Roger, the son of Richard and Judith Adey, baptized 28th of March, 1619. John, the son of Richard and Judith Adey, this is our John, baptized July the 31st, 1625. So not only has the vicar filled in 3 baptisms from an earlier point, that before the beginning of this register, which was 1637, he goes on, Judith Adey, the mother of the above, was born the 9th of July, 1582. So Judith Adey, we don't actually know when she was baptized, but we do know that she was born on the 9th of July, 1582. That's the oldest recorded birth that we have in the village. And she departed this life the 8th of June, 1653. John goes on to marry in 1646, when he's just coming up to 21. He marries Elizabeth Elliot. Now, there's quite a lot of circumstantial evidence that suggests that she's actually, what would you know, Elliot alias Clark, which of course connects him back to John and Richard Clark that we were talking about earlier. If we look at the registers for the next 20 years or so, we find John and Elizabeth baptizing no fewer than 10 children, with only the 9th, Lawrence, dying as a child. So John's shop and house was a busy and probably a noisy place. We look at the AD wills, we find that there are three that help us understand the family. First of all comes the will of Thomas, who had died in 1620. He was the uncle of John the trader. And he starts, in the name of God, amen. The 23rd day of November, I, Thomas, AD of Auborn in the county of Wilts and diocese of Sarum, and goes on, and he gives a bequeath to his sister Ellen, £10. And there's quite a bit in here about how Richard, his brother, should treat Ellen, his sister. But there's also an interesting sideline in here about English grammar, surprisingly. If I can find the relevant words. Yes. The money should remain in my brother Richard AD, his hands. This is the, nowadays we would say Richard AD's with an apostrophe S. And I was always taught at school that the apostrophe stood for his. And here we actually have that construction, Richard AD, his hands. And it happens again further down. I give to my sister Alice her child, 6 shillings and 8p. He's not giving it to Sister Alice, he's giving it to Sister Alice's child. There's nothing in Thomas's will or his inventory, which is here, that suggests, it gives us any clue that he was a merchant. It merely mentions wool. He has 7 sheep here, and here he has £20 of wool. That's the only thing that maybe is to do with his business. The next thing that happens, the next AD's will, does give us a taste. And it's the will of this young chap here who's being baptized in 1654, Thomas, the son of John and Elizabeth AD. And here again, we have his birth date as well, which is very unusual in our registers. He was born the 4th of July, about 10 o'clock in the morning, and baptized on July the 23rd. So not only do we know his date of birth, we know what time he was born as well, which is quite extraordinary. So he was born in 1654, but he died very unexpectedly in 1679. He was only 25. Of course, being so young, he'd not made a will. And so his widow, Mary, who was Mary Lydiard, one for Karen, and Thomas's father, John, had to apply to the court for the authority to administer the estate. And this is the bond. And once again, this first section is in, this first indented section is all in Latin. Nova universi per presentes nos Mariam AD de Auborn in comitatate wilts viduam. Know all men by these presents that we, Mary AD of Auborn in the county of Wiltshire, widow John AD of the same place, grocer, and Robert Butcher of Marlborough in the aforesaid county grocer. So John is reckoned to be Thomas rather, is reckoned to be a grocer. And this is 1679. And this obligation requires them to pay centum et quinquaginta libris, £150 of legal English money if they fail to administer the will properly. So it's a fairly serious obligation, and that they have to administer the estate of Thomas and distribute it according to law. If we look at the inventory that goes with this, we've got the usual preamble, and in the hall, his books, his clothes and money in the house, in the hall, 8 pewter platters, a looking glass in the buttery. Really not interested in the chamber. And we carry on down. And here we get to the bit that we're interested in. In the shop. Item 9 dozen and a half of candles, 13 pairs of men's stockings, 7 pairs of children's hose, 25 pairs of women's and children's hose. That's the bottom of the first page, and it goes on. 15 pounds of thread, pins, salt, ribbon and galloons, which is a lace ribbon, bone lace, silk lace and silk laces, 12 dozen of gimp lace, which is another kind of ribbon type lace, 6 dozen of caddis laces, caddis and cotton. And so it goes on, all manner of things, paper, parcels of thread and tapes, cards and tobacco boxes, fruit and spice and sugar, and some other things as soap and ale and hips, counter shelves, boxes, scales and weights, all the things that belong in his shop. So we've got a very good idea of the kind of general store come haberdashers come draper that was the shop of Thomas Adey. We go on to his son now, John Adey. Finally, we get to John Adey. Here is his will. We're nearly done. It looks a bit different. Couldn't quite make out this will. I've never seen quite such a messy will with crossings out and insertions. Oh, sorry, that turned over 2 pages of my notes, sorry. Here we are, in the name of God, amen, blah, blah, blah. I, John Adey of Holborn, in the county of Wilts, mercer. Now, he doesn't describe himself as being a grocer, he's a mercer, a merchant. I've looked him up in the list of the Mercers Company of London. And although he describes himself as a mercer, he's not actually a member of the Mercers Company. He goes on, he leaves the house and his lands to his son, John, who's charged with providing his widow, Elizabeth, with an annuity. And then there's line after line, about a quarter of the document are really complex arrangements to deal with what's obviously an ongoing dispute between mother and son. He goes on to say that he's made arrangements, made provision for the rest of his children. So he leaves them and his grandchildren only a token amount. He goes on way down here to appoint Elizabeth as leaves her the residue of his estate and appoints her as executrix. And he appoints his sons-in-law, Thomas Mott and John Ayres, and his friend, and I'm looking for the reference to him, his friend, here we go, my loving son-in-laws, Thomas Mott and John Ayres, and my loving friend, Oliver Core, to be overseers of this, my last will and testament. And then it finishes off, I have hereunto set my hand and seal the day and year above written, but that's the end of the document. It's not signed. And that's the reason why this has so many crossings out and so many insertions. He obviously died before he had a chance to have a good copy made of this will and to sign it. So this is a will that he made but never signed. The result is that there had to be a court hearing to decide that it really was his will. And here we have the record of the court. And the first part is all in Latin, but the rest is in English, so I'm sure you'll all be able to read it. The first section, the vicar of Aldbourne, William Jackson, has come to swear that he knows John Adey and he knows his handwriting, and he believes that the paper really is in John Adey's handwriting. And then Thomas Coleman of Aldbourne comes and he swears the same thing and signs the document. John Ayres, this is the son-in-law, a near neighbour and well acquainted with the writing of John Adey. He also swears that it really is a true document, and there's John Ayres' signature. Gabriel Martin of Upham comes as well and swears that he knows this to be the writing. Gabriel Martin, if anybody's paid really good attention and has a really good memory, you might remember Gabriel Martin bought farm from one Obadiah Sedgwick. And I talked about him in my talk on Snap a couple of years ago. And finally, this is the interesting one, Oliver Core comes, and he is also intimately acquainted and swears that it's John Adey's writing. And he goes on. He also says that he has good reason to believe the will to be for that about 3 weeks since, which was shortly before the death of John Adey. He met him in the street, and John Adey told him that he had just made his will and that he'd made his wife executrix and that he'd made the deponent, Oliver Core, and John Ayres and Thomas Mott overseers, and hoped that they would handle the case and help his wife to perform his will. And then Oliver Core has signed it. That was accepted as a true will. An inventory was made. And once again, we've got this list of all of the things which were in the shop. And this is the very end of my talk. He just received an Amazon delivery because the first item in this section of the inventory, grocery goods now come from London, £13, 14 and 2. 4 pairs of silk crepe, 2 pairs of gimp lace, 1 black worsted crepe. And so it goes on, various kinds of material and silk, colored threads, white threads, pins, cards, buttons, everything that you'd expect to see in a village shop. Seeds, spices, raisins, prunes, and some small things in boxes. 10 dozen candles, alum, treacle, and glue, G-L-E-W, glue. And I think our local agricultural labourers must have been very, very careless with their clay pipes, because John Adey thought that it was necessary to hold in stock 13 gross of pipes. 13 gross is not far short of 2,000 pipes. Tobacco, glasses, earthenware. So he sells crockery, cheese, 250 of cheese, just amazing soap, salt, oatmeal, a remnant of tabby, which was a kind of shot silk. It goes on and on and on. The amount that was in that shop, and that's set out to be a 10-minute talk, and I'm afraid I've getting on for an hour, so I must hand back to Cassie to cover tokens of the later period. So I'll take questions at the end of the talk. So Cassie, can I hand back to you?
Okay, if you want to stop sharing, and
yeah,
I will.
There we go.
I will share mine. Right.
I'm pleased to see nobody's asleep.
Right, where are we? Okay, so after that period, the government did manage to start producing some copper coinage and suppress things for a while. But we get into the 18th century, we have new problems. We've now got an industrial revolution. Large numbers of people have left the countryside and are now getting paid in mills and factories and the like. But the proper coinage distribution was fairly patchy. London gets a lot, and strangely enough, where the mills in the north and the Midlands are, they don't get very much. Matthew Bolton, as in Bolton and Watt, the great industrial entrepreneur, reckoned that 2/3 of all copper coins in circulation in the late 18th century were counterfeit. Once again, this is Gresham's law kicking in and making life hard for the government. Mill owners had a real struggle paying their workmen. They either had to go hunting around trying to gather up all the small change they could find in the neighborhood, or they had a few rather dodgy practices, like giving a £1 note to 5 workmen and saying, it's your problem, or paying the men in the pub and gathering back the small change at the end of the evening so that they could then pay the next batch of employees in the pub the next evening. You know, we look at it now and you think, no, you can't do that. But there are no all-born tokens at the tail end of the 18th century. As you will have noticed, we don't have industrial revolution mills. And we, by this time, have had 2 of the major fires, which rather decimated things and disrupted all the industry. And relatively speaking, we were closer to London, so we probably didn't have quite the same need. But, you know, some places they did, and we'll whip through this fairly quick. This is a Paris mining company now, Anglesey. They were mining copper, so they had mountains of copper and no small change. So they fixed that. They minted their own. And This is a rather beautiful coin. It's one of the early ones, the Druid pennies. And revolutionary industrialists, it's not surprising that they produced their own. And you get a huge plethora of designs. It's at this point, it's almost more interesting collecting the tokens than it is the coinage if you're into coin collecting. So the Royal Mint at this point was still using two-man screw presses to produce one coin at a time. So Matthew Boulton is campaigning to produce the new official copper coins. In 1788, he'd built the first steam mint in the world, but the government still hadn't got around to agreeing. So in the meantime, he's minting coins for the East India Company by the 100 tons. It's 100 tons of coins. It's an awful lot of coins. Mind you, India is a big place. And he's done it for other countries, and he's doing them for tokens. One order from John Wilkinson, the Iron Master Wilkinson, was for 5 tons of tokens. Bolton's mint had eight large screw presses, all linked together in a circle, minting up to 120 coins in a minute. And rather than employing 2 men to operate the things, all it needed was one 12-year-old boy who kept an eye on it. It's just, this is proper industrialization. He also did medallions to celebrate George III's health returning. If you did get into this sort of thing, at this point, the token producers start getting a bit wise to the fact that people are collecting them and start putting the wrong combination of the die halves together to create sort of higher value stuff. But and then finally, in 1797, we do have a sort of solution. The government agrees to Bolton minting copper coins, and we get the cartwheel penny. And it looks lovely. But that contains a penny's worth of copper, and they did a tuppenny as well, pretty much the same design, which just contained 2p worth of copper. So the penny was 23 grams and 36 millimeters across. So we're talking, which is the same size as a modern £5 coin, or for those of you who want to hark back slightly, a crown. And that's for a single penny. And obviously the 2p weighed twice as much. Unsurprisingly, these weren't terribly popular because it made your pocket rather heavy. But from this point, they did start actually minting a decent number of copper coins and starting to suppress the whole token market. But 19th century got more problems. Still, the copper coins aren't getting through enough. Price of copper's fallen. Mines have got a surplus. And you even get counterfeit copper tokens or fictitiously named ones being issued. And there's a shortage of silver coins during and just after the Napoleonic Wars. So you get ones like this. This is a Marlborough shilling token. You get more of the shillings and sixpences, but you do get copper ones as well. And they were tolerated for a while. You get quite a lot of these sort of county-wide coins, so Bristol and Wiltshire. But finally, in 1817, they passed an act banning the tokens from the 1st of January 1818, with a few exceptions, of course. But the exceptions are finally stopped in 1820, which is the end of monetary tokens pretty much in the UK. You do get tokens emulating coins being used as gaming pieces. This is one that's emulating a spade guinea. But obviously you read the text around the side, in memory of the good old days. It's not what you get in a normal coin, but I think these were probably used as gaming pieces so that people weren't playing with money, but felt like they were. And then we could divert slightly onto this chap, Ernest Augustus. He was one of the sons of George III. So George III's eldest son, George, Prince of Wales, later King George IV had one child, Charlotte, who had been expected to be the Queen, but she died in 1817. So Ernest at this point starts thinking he might be able to get to succeed. However, his elder brother, Edward Augustus, Duke of Kent, fourth son, eventually fathered Queen Victoria. So that actually, in actuality, scuppered it. But this Ernest Augustus had been an active member of the House of Lords, and you read the Wikipedia, it's unbelievable, where he maintained an extremely conservative record. There were persistent allegations, reportedly spread by his foes, that he had murdered his valet, had fathered a son by his sister Sophia, and intended to take the throne by murdering Victoria. So quite a sort of character who certainly attracts notoriety, if nothing else. So when his elder brother died, Victoria couldn't take over the throne of Hanover because it had, under Hanoverian law, it had to be a chap. So Ernest went to Hanover and became Hanover's first resident ruler since George I. And now you'll see why I mentioned him. We get this token, which is called a Cumberland Jack, because our chap had been Duke of Cumberland. So he's left to become the Elector of Hanover. So you see it says to Hanover. So this is a slightly later gaming token, rather satirically produced. After that, tokens in Britain, we get a few sort of not very interesting sort of local trade type things just issued by co-op. They're not really coinage as such. I don't think we'll ever miss, there will always be tokens somewhere or cropping up again, because it's an obvious thing when official coinage fails. And we'll just touch on Notgeld in Germany and Austria after the First World War. They issued an awful lot of paper tokens, again, by the local councils. Huge plethora of designs. So they're taking the place of money because they had the hyperinflation. That's sort of tokens. I do know we had a couple of questions in, one from Alan, well, both from Alan. What was the etymology of farthing? So looked it up in good old Oxford dictionaries. Old English fjorthing from fjortha, a fourth, perhaps patterned on the Old Norse, or a fjorthungar, maybe. I'm probably not pronouncing my Norse correctly. So it's a fourth. Makes sense. And how did we know that people know that they were actually farthings without being marked as such? We saw the strong token was marked as a halfpenny. I don't know. I wonder whether it was word of mouth or an assumption that's, I don't know. I haven't seen a good description of how they knew. While I touch on the Alborn tokens, we should mention that there is one that we don't have an example of yet, which is the John AD on one side, and then he's got the Mercer's Arms on the other. That Mercer's Arms looks like a shield with 3 cloves in it, I think, and I think it's an up arrow. And that's tokens from both of us, I think. So, John, do you want to open it out to any other questions, and we'll see where we go? Okay,
yes, we've had one question already, has come in from Donna, basically for me. Do we know where any of the shops were in the village? So yes, I'm sure they would have been attached to the family home. Do we know where any of them were in the village? Well, we know where the Calendar house of Thomas Witt's was, because that was next to the George Inn, which is the house at the bottom of the green opposite Hightown House. So that's the only one that we actually know where it was. Yes. Yeah. do we have any more questions? Feel free to unmute yourself or to wave at me or whatever. Do we have any more questions?
Can I speak?
Yes, please do, Sylvia.
I was just wondering if you know anything about the provenance of the actual coins you bought, whether they'd been dug up, found, came from some. I know they came from somebody's collection, but
I'm not sure. I don't think any of these were from metal detecting finds, as far as I know. I know that the two lots which we bought at auction last month, or was it? Yes, last month. I know that they came from a huge collection of one of the serious authorities on English tokens, who died quite recently, and there was the auction that we were involved with was an auction of thousands upon thousands of tokens.
so he would have just bought them.
He would have bought them. Yes, he would.
Yeah.
He would.
I think they'd have been passed, largely speaking, been passed through from various, collector to collector to collector, as collectors either decided to dispose of them or departed this earth. A lot of the ones that we recently acquired are in far too good a condition to have been buried for very long. That, as John showed, they're tiny coins, but they're also really thin. They're really slight little things. You'd barely feel it if you had it on your finger. They don't. That sort of very thin little coin doesn't tend to survive, certainly to that level of detail in the soil, very well.
You talked about the manufacturing process, Cassie, but were these makers actually making them somewhere in Aldbourne, you think?
Oh no. I think by this time you got specialised minters actually producing them. It's quite common that you get the same designs repeated on the back, so you'll get a name on one side, and then they're using a common back die for different people's coins. So the Mercer's arms crop up an awful lot. The shuttle isn't actually a terribly unusual design either.
Okay, thank you.
Terry, unmute yourself, Terry, and Terry, unmute yourself.
Yeah, okay, John. Yeah. You remember a few weeks ago we were lent a token by Michael Hale of Baden Hill Farm, which was a Salisbury token. Now that was found by metal detector on Baden Hill Farm, and I was just wondering what. Obviously, someone from Salisbury must have had it in their pocket and lost it, and what they were doing here, I don't know. But were they interchangeable between places at all? That's my question.
I suspect, certainly if you've got a population that is, let's say, patchily literate, not all of them are literate. So if someone hands you what looks like a token, you can't read what it says on it, you're going to just treat it like a coin and pass it around, and they'll travel around. So you'd end up with a sort of distribution pattern of all the coins that are closest to, most of the coins will be close to their main source, but then you'll get odd ones sort of spread out further and further afield. So I suspect they ended up being treated like small change, because everyone knew that you could still go back to John Adey of Aldbourne and say, if I present you with, where is it, 480 of these, I'll have
960 actually.
Yeah. But that does some of the later coins, the 18th century ones, do actually say that on them. These will be exchanged for, if you present 480 of these, we'll exchange it for £1.
I thought you might like to see a clipped coin as opposed to the actual clippings. I don't know whether you can
Oh
see.
yeah,
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes.
And that's been
A
taken off.
long cross penny.
yeah.
It's an Elizabethan shilling of 1575.
Oh, right.
And, it's the reason, of course, we have milling round the edges,
Yeah,
coins, to stop them being clipped.
and if Bolton had had his way, the coinage would have said around the outside, "Render unto Caesar what is Caesar's." That was his first suggestion.
Alan.
Alan?
Alan, you're muted at the minute. Oh, there.
Yeah, thank you, John and Cassie. I'm just going to say I looked up roughly what the equivalent purchasing power was for the old farthing tokens. That was about 25 pence in today's money. So it gives people some idea that, you know, that would, and you could buy a lot for 25 pence in those days. So the actual purchasing power was quite significant, even for a farthing. So that's always something to bear in mind. So you probably wouldn't need a lot of them to be able to purchase quite a lot of goods, I would imagine. Thank you.
When I was at primary school, we could send over to the local handy stores a farthing and get an OXO cube in return.
An
Exchange
oxen cube.
ratio in 1945 or some such date. And of course, because you couldn't get sugar, the salt in an OXO cube was what boys like me regarded as a real treat.
Of course, when I was a kid, I've been known to take halfpennies to the railway and put them on the lines while a train went over them and come back with a penny.
While we're talking about the spending value of a farthing, it's also worth noting that at one point we did have a third of a farthing coins as well.
Good grief.
So they were tiny copper ones, beginning of the 19th century.
Okay, are there any more questions? If not, then I just have to thank Cassie and thank you all for coming and joining us this evening. And we look forward to the next talk, and we look forward perhaps to that being live and in the chapel. So our next event in July, as I mentioned before, will be Alan and Diletta's mystery walk around the village over the weekend of the 24th and 25th of July.
Right.
So stay safe.